some of the things that we did were kind of creating a table. So we said, for example, we can create a table by doing create table, and we say student, and maybe we give it kind of first name and last name. And of course, the data type of first name would be maybe varchar. I like to use uppercase here, and maybe say 100 characters, that's the limit. And for this one, also say varchar, and the limit is going to be, also 100 maybe. And I'm going to just highlight this and hit play, and you will see here on the right that the table will be created. And of course, we can double click on it. You can ignore this. This is kind of an old table. It's going to actually be replaced in a second. All right, still connecting. Let me kind of close it and double click. Maybe it will be better that way. Okay, all right. So you can see here we have last name, first name. And if we go back to the console, not this one, essentially that's what we did, right? Now the order doesn't really matter. We can actually kind of move things around. Let's not worry about the order for now. So again, we can just move things around, and each column has a name, and we're going to use that name to reference that column. So order is not going to matter that much for us now. And we can close some stuff that I created 2 weeks ago or last week. Okay. Do you guys remember how to delete the table? How do I get rid of that table?
The drop command again.
All right, so that's good. Someone, I think it's Stefan, said we can drop. So essentially we can drop table and we can drop student. So we've done that. I don't want to do that now. I want to show you some kind of new stuff. Of course, we can insert into the table. So we've done that here. You can kind of review the recordings that I posted. But what I'm going to do is I'd like to add a new column. So let's say you create a table, and let's say you forget to kind of add a column, and you want to do that. Of course, one way to do that would be to drop the table, essentially get rid of it, and then create another table that has that column. And that's okay. But of course, sometimes your table has data. So let's say, for example, here, you have data here. John is, I'm just kind of coming up with random values. Susan is here. And if you, of course, commit, that's going to save the, the stuff that I added. And let's say you want to add age. Again, you can drop the table, then create a new one, but that's not very kind of practical, because you're going to have to put all this data again, and you might have thousands or millions of data points. So here's how you do that. And this is new stuff. We can actually alter the table. So we would say alter table. And of course, we want to alter student. And then what we want to do is we want to add a column. So we would say add column, and we would give it a name. Say maybe we want to add age, and the data type is going to be int. And essentially, if you execute this line, it's going to add a new column to the table. So that's the syntax. That's Postgres syntax for adding a new column to the table student. So I'm going to actually highlight this and hit play, and it'll take a second. And once it's done, you see that age is here. And of course, if we go back to student, and if we refresh this table, you see that age has been added. Do you guys have any questions about this? Okay, so there is a problem here. It's not really a problem, but kind of a minor issue. And that is age doesn't have any values yet for the existing kind of rows, for those rows. And because of that, Postgres decided to give age the value null. Essentially, we don't really know what the age is. And what you might want to do is you might provide a default value. So this is actually pretty common to provide kind of a default value when you create a new column. And let's do that here. So I want to get rid of age, and then I want to create age again, but with a default value. So I'm just kind of doing random things here. and I'll give you time to kind of ask questions or ask me to, do something different. But I'm gonna just get rid of age, and this is a new syntax. So I'm gonna say alter table, and I'm gonna say student, and I'm gonna say drop column. So you'll get used to kind of guessing what the syntax is, because as I said earlier, we use drop to get rid of, essentially delete stuff, but that relate to the structure of the table. So the table has kind of columns, each column has a data type. All of that is really structure of the table, and the rows is not really structure, it's data. So if you want to delete rows, we don't really use drop, we use delete. But if you want to change the structure, we use drop. So because changing the column or removing a column is actually changing the structure of a table, we have to use drop. So of course, you might guess that what comes after that is age. I mean, that's kind of pretty easy to guess. So if I kind of highlight this and hit play, it'll take a second. And did it execute? Let's try again. Okay, so I think I didn't hit play. And you can see here that age is gone. If we go back to the table and if we refresh the page or this kind of table, you see that age will be gone. So do you guys have any questions about this? All right, is that clear? Are you all happy with what I'm showing you? Okay. All right, so let's talk about this kind of default value. We'll talk about a few things today. Let's start with the default value. So again, you want to add age. So I'm going to actually do this, but you do want to have a default value, and then maybe you can change it later. But a default value is actually useful. So here, after you say it's data type int, you can say default and you give it a value. Say for example 30. Now, if you execute this line, it'll add a new column, age. Of course, the data type is int, and the default will be 30, which means that for these three kind of rows, they will have the value 30. So let me kind of execute this one. All right, you can see that age is here, has been added. If I go here, if I refresh the page, you can see that we have 30. Now, if I add a new row here using this, this kind of GUI, I can give, first name, which let me kind of reorder this a little bit. Let me just say Adam, and let me say G here, it doesn't really matter. Notice here that there's a default value. Of course, I can give it a value here. I can double click and give it, 35 or 50. But if I leave it like this, and if I commit or submit my changes, just essentially, save my changes, you notice that Adam right now has age 30. Again, let me create another one. Let me say George B. And here I can, of course, say 60. And if I submit, of course, 60 will be the value that will be used. So if you don't provide a value, default will be used. So that's actually pretty useful. Now, I should say something that maybe some of you are thinking of. When you create a table like this, again, we've done that before, you can say default here. So you're allowed to do default and then some value. That's perfectly fine. We haven't done that, but I don't think we did. I'm looking at the code here. I don't think we did. But when you create a table, you can give it the default. So you don't have to add the default after. I hope that's clear. Another thing that we can do, we can remove the default. Now, this is not as common, but of course, you might want to remove kind of this constraint, the default constraint. And of course, if you remove it, then when you add a new row, there won't be a default. We can do that now, or we can do that later. I guess we can do it really now quickly. Again, it's not very common, but it always starts with alter table again. So that's something you'll be able to guess soon. And now we don't want to add a column. We don't want to drop a column clearly. We want to change a column. So we want to change this column age and we want to remove the default. And because of that, we can alter the column. Okay, guys, so we alter the column and we can essentially specify the column name. And of course, in this case, it's going to be age. That's the column that we want to alter. And now we want to remove, or rather drop, the default constraint. So we can just say drop default. You can see it continues for you. So that's helpful. So if I kind of highlight this and hit play, now if I go back to student and if I refresh, of course, nothing changes here. But if I try to add a new row, you notice that there's no default here. And if I start with something, well, let's say something here, notice here that if I save, it'll actually stay null. So you can see that it didn't give it a default value, which I think makes sense. That's what you would think would happen. Let me pause here. Let me go back here and pause and see if you guys have any questions. So this is, a few more commands. And again, I'll pause the recording, but let me pause and see if you have any questions. All right, so no questions here. So do you guys remember something that I said last week and maybe the week before about tables? So I said that tables should have something. When you create a table, you want to make sure that something is there in the table. Do you guys remember what that is? Asasia, is that how you pronounce your name? Did you want to answer? So I have a question. The question is, do you remember what I said last week and the week before about creating tables? So there's something that you want to make sure that you do. Okay, so Asasia is saying the ID, and that is correct. When you create a table, you don't have to have an ID, but you really should. So here, of course, we created a table without an ID, but that's not a very good idea. So you want to always have an ID, and you want to make sure that the ID is a primary key. So it's unique for every, in this case, student, but essentially for every row. So of course, we can add an ID. Let's do that. So I'm going to say alter table student. And I'm going to say add column, right, guys? I'm just kind of practicing here, ID, and I can say int, right? This is really what you would think we would do, and that's perfectly fine. It takes a few milliseconds. If I go back here, if I refresh, you will see that there's an ID, and you can see it actually goes at the beginning, which is nice. Again, order, for now, let's just ignore the order. We can move things around here. Now here we do have kind of few problems. One of them is right now ID is all null, and we should probably give those rows some IDs, and maybe they should be unique. So maybe I'm going to say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So right now they're unique. Now that's not kind of good enough yet, because if you create another row that has, say, for example, 20 with another name possibly, you will notice that when you save, it'll work. It's not going to complain. So you can see here we have two kind of names and they have the same ID, and that's a problem. The reason why this is a problem, because I haven't kind of specified that my ID should be a primary key. So I have two options in this case, guys. When you, of course, there's the obvious option is when you create the table, make sure that you have an ID, which is a primary key, which is kind of, we've done that before, and you can see that here, okay? So that's kind of how you do it. The second option would be to add a new column, kind of with ID column, and don't make it primary, but once you add it, you can add a primary key kind of constraint. So I created this kind of column, and once I create the column, I can add this constraint. Okay, so that's kind of another option. Of course, a third option would be to add a new column ID and make sure that it's a primary key. So when you add a new column, make sure that it's a primary key. Now this can be problematic a little bit, and I can show you when that would be. I'm gonna show you a few examples. What I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna get rid of ID. So I'm gonna get rid of ID. So I'm gonna say alter, right guys, alter table, student, drop column, and it's gonna be ID. Let me do that. Of course, dropping a column is always okay for the most part. It's not gonna complain. Okay, all right, so if I go here, refresh here, you can see that I don't have ID. It keeps kind of reordering them, and that's okay for now. Okay, so I'm gonna do the same thing here. I'm gonna kind of add a new column, and of course it's called ID, excuse me, and it's an integer, and I wanna say it's a primary key. Do you guys see what I'm doing here? So I'm kind of doing this thing. I'm adding a new column ID. Of course, it doesn't have to be ID, but ID is really the name that's usually used. And I want to make sure that it's a primary key when I add it. Now, this could cause problems, and probably you can guess what the problems are. The problems are we already have kind of few rows. And if you put a primary key, what are the values of those primary keys will be? Of course, you can't give it a default value because they have to be different for each kind of row. Do you guys see the problem here? Let me pause here and see. I want you to kind of be paying attention to what I'm saying. Do you see the problem? Give me a reaction in Zoom. The problem is if you add a primary key, what would the values of that primary key be? You don't want to give it a default value, because if default means they're all going to be the same, and that's the opposite of a primary key definition. So the definition of primary keys, they all have to be different. They all have to be unique. So we can try that. I think it'll complain. I actually haven't tried it. It shouldn't work, but we can try it and see what's going to happen. You can see it didn't like it. It says, well, ID, it's going to contain null values, and that's primary keys. We don't like that. So when you have a primary key, you shouldn't want to have null values. And by default, we have null values if you don't have a default value. Now, even if you have a default value, again, that's not going to help you, because if you have a default 10, that means they all have to be 10, and it's not going to work that way either. We can try this. Okay, you can see here, didn't like it because 10 is going to be duplicated, and we don't like that. Okay, let me kind of refresh and show you that it hasn't been created. Are we guys on the same page here? Okay, that's good. I need some feedback because I can't see your faces, I can't hear your voices, and it's important for me to get some sort of feedback. Okay. All right, so that's kind of that's not working here. So this is kind of, it's not working really. So maybe we can do this. Maybe. Well, sure. I do want to give this another try. And this one is going to be new to probably most of you. And the idea here is I don't want the data type to be an int. I want it to be serial. So serial is actually an integer that kind of auto increments. So usually when you have a primary key, like here, for example, even though you can do an int, it's fine. Typically what people do is they do serial. And serial essentially is going to be an integer. However, it's going to auto increment by default. So each time you add a new row, it'll actually determine what the ID should be. And this is very convenient. And I'm going to try that. I don't know if it'll work, but of course we don't have a default. it's clear that default doesn't make sense. So we shouldn't have a default here. Instead of having an int, I want to have a serial here. And I'm going to hope, I don't know if it'll work. I'm going to hope that it's going to start by 1 as an ID or 0. Usually it starts as 1. And it'll auto increment for all of them. Let's see if it'll work. Again, I'm not really sure if it'll work or not. If it doesn't, we'll just go with this one. We add a kind of an ID and then we make it a primary key. So let's try to execute this one. Okay, so it actually worked. So what probably happened is what I said, or what I hoped would happen. Essentially, it's going to add an ID and it'll auto increment each time. So let's go back to student. Let me refresh here. Notice here that it added an ID. It's a primary key, of course, and it auto increments. So if you look here, you see that it's actually an integer. So it's an integer just like age, even though we haven't used integer, we've used serial. You see here, we've used serial. Again, it's an integer, but we kind of specified that the value of the integer is going to be the next kind of number. So essentially, it's going to auto increment. That's really what that means. So let me show you one example, and then I'll pause here and see if you have any questions. For example, if I add a new row here, notice here that there's a default, and this default essentially is the auto increment. It's not going to be like 7 or anything that we've used before. It'll be 8. So here I'm going to say, for example, Robert. And this one is age. So age could be anything, right? And last name could be anything too, right? So if I save this, you notice that this default ID should be 8. Is that good, guys? All right, do you have any questions about kind of anything that we did here so far?
Would there be a way to manually create your own serial default type, like almost like a default script that would do the same thing?
That's actually a very good question. So maybe if I understand you correctly, you want to create your own kind of default
Like say I wanted a
column.
serial with both letters and numbers. Could I define that in a command for a default value that would auto increment?
So you want it for strings and numbers. And what would you want it to be, for example? So let's say I insert a new row. What would you want it to be? Like, for example, L1, L2, L3, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you can do that, but I don't know how to do that now. But that's a very good question, because you might want to do that, and it's actually useful to do that. Essentially, you're creating some kind of user-defined default or auto-increment values. This is kind of a little bit advanced, but I like the question. I think it's a very good question. I haven't done it. I haven't seen anyone does it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it can be done. But it's a little bit advanced, but I like the question. Let me look into it and see if there's a way to do that. And if there's a way, we can talk about that. I'll talk about it in the next kind of video. That's good. So Zach is asking a question. How would you add a default to last name? We can do that, of course. You can add a default to any column, and it'll be actually similar to what we've done kind of here. So we can say alter table. I like this. So I like having you ask questions. This is important, and it's better than me kind of keep, of course, at some point, maybe if you're asking so many questions, I'll tell you, let's kind of continue talking about new stuff, but having questions is better at this stage. So I'm going to say alter table, and I'm going to say alter column. So I'm going to do something very similar to this, guys, except that I don't want to have a default for age. I want to have a default for first or last name. Let me say last name. Oops, last name like this. And I'm going to say default. Let me see. How did we do? We did add default. Did we just say the alter column? Let me see. It's going to be default, add okay. So add constraint. Where did we have that? I think we did that. We didn't do that. Let me kind of, maybe we just dropped, but we didn't really add a constraint, a default. Or did we? I feel like we did do that. Let me see. It's not this one, not here, not here, not here, because this one is, yeah, I don't think we did actually what Zach's saying. So let's kind of, yeah, so this is new. I thought we did it. What we want to do is we want to add kind of a default to an existing column. So this we haven't done. Let me see. This should be add default. We can try that. Add default. And maybe it's going to be, I don't know, let's say LL, doesn't really matter. Okay, it doesn't seem that it likes it. No, it doesn't like that. How about we do this? I don't think it will like that. So Zach's saying we did. I don't know which line is it if we did, because this one is different. This one you're creating a column with a default. You're not adding a default to a column. But let's try to do that for a string. So maybe this is really what Zach is asking about. So let's kind of try to do this for a string, and then we can talk about kind of adding a default. There are ways to do all of that. But so I think it's better to kind of add comments here so that I don't confuse myself. But I want to do something similar to this, guys. But I want to add kind of add a column. Let's say a new column. Let's say, for example, year, or let's say semester. And I'm going to say it's a varchar, which is maybe 100. And I'm going to do the default being kind of fall semester, something like that. So if you do that, it should work. So that's okay. If you go back here, if you refresh, you see that we have this. Now let me look at the chat window. Okay, so hopefully that kind of answers Zach's question, because right now we're doing the same thing for a string here. Again, we'll talk about kind of adding a default after if you want, but let me see. Another student asking, it appends it at the end. Again, let's not worry about ordering for now. You can just move it here using the GUI. And if you want to display it in some order, we can specify the order in the for example, if you want to display it in some order, you can say select kind of semester, then ID, then first name. You can specify the order that you want from a student like this. And if you do this, it'll be displayed in this order. So again, let's not worry too much about the order. You can see that it's displayed in this order. So using the GUI, you can always kind of move things around. And if you want to display something in a particular order using SQL, then essentially you would specify the order that you want to display the columns in. Is that good, guys? Okay. Now I did try to add a default to an existing column, and that actually did not work. So for example, if we want to add a default for first name, I would think it would be alter table, student, alter column, first name, and then add default. I mean, that's what I would kind of do. Let me see, first name is Sam. That's what I kind of would do, but it clearly doesn't work. So there is some other way of doing this. You should be able to add a default after, kind of after the fact, after kind of creating a particular column. I don't know, I'm looking at my notes here. I don't think I have an example for that. That's interesting. I'll look into that too. So, all right. So let's kind of add some comments here, make sure that we're not confusing ourselves. So here, this is for adding a column. And this is for kind of dropping a column. And this is for adding a column with, a default value. This one's going to be dropping the default constraint. This one is just adding a column, so maybe I can move it to here. Well, it's the same. It's kind of pretty much the same thing. Let's call this adding a column with a constraint. Okay, so this one is dropping the column. Let me put this here. This one is adding a column with a constraint. Sure, that's actually here. Because you're adding ID with this primary key constraint. Now, of course, the data type here is serial for auto-incrementing. Here, I'm kind of also adding with a constraint. Well, that's actually identical to this one. Let me get rid of this. So I'm doing some stuff here. You can think of questions while I do that. Adding a column with a constraint. That's for strings. That's good. And this is, displaying the table with a particular column order. Okay. And here that kind of didn't work. So, all right. So that's what we're doing here. Okay. That's not working. We have to look into it. So I'm going to look into that, look into this, and also kind of creating or defining kind of our own serial default kind of values. I think that's for Stephen asked this question, and I'll look into that. Okay, let's see. Let's continue. All right. Do you guys have anything you want to do? Any questions? Again, I like those questions, even though I may not be able to answer all of them, but still I like them nonetheless. Okay, let's see. All right, no questions here. So maybe one thing that we can do. Okay, actually, there is something that I want us to all think about. And it's about this kind of auto increment. So if I do another one, and if I give it, random name, of course, here that can be anything, can be default, doesn't have to be. Here, there's a default value for that, that's fine. And here we have, I think we have a default value for this one too. I think I did add one. No, I didn't add one for last time, I added one for this. I think I modified a column and I added, oh, well, I couldn't do that. Yeah, okay, well, that's all good. Okay, so this one's gonna be whatever, some value here. And you notice that this one's gonna be 9. Now, one question that maybe one of you is gonna ask, what if I get rid of this? What if I delete this one? Do you guys remember how we delete? Did I show you this, guys, or not? Well, I think I haven't shown you how to delete. So let me delete it here manually for now. I don't want to kind of be talking about too many things at the same time. Let's talk about this primary key, and then after that, I'll show you how you can delete maybe from the SQL. So I'm going to get rid of this by just clicking here and doing delete, just pressing the delete button. And of course, I'm going to save. And notice here that 5 is gone. Now, if you create a new row, the question is it going to use 5 or is it going to keep incrementing? And that's a good question. Now, maybe it's not important for you because you can just say, well, I don't really care as long as each one is unique. You know, I'm not really interested in the actual values. And that's okay too. That's a good way of looking at it. But, you know, sometimes it's good to kind of experiment and try to kind of see how that kind of works. For example, you can give it anything random, like say, for example, Jordan. And I'm just gonna save that. Okay, so here we have a 10. Okay, so it kind of didn't use 5. Okay, that's good. How about if you delete Jordan and you add a new one? What do you guys think? Let me see what I just want to kind of, I'm curious. What do you think? If I delete this row and if I create a new one, which ID would it use? So you need to know, I mean, this is all kind of material that you're going to be quizzed on. It's good to kind of try to guess first. What do you think? If I kind of delete this one, I'm going to delete it now and I'm going to save. And if I create a new row, what do you think the ID is going to be? Okay, so it seems that you're thinking 11, and that's actually correct. So if I do something like this, you notice that it's 11. So even though it could have used 10, but actually it uses 11. Now here's something that's kind of interesting. If I create a new one myself and give it maybe the value 15, okay, so right now I'm not gonna use the default value, which actually is not a very good thing to do. When you create an auto increment, you want to make sure that you just let it do what it does. So you don't want to kind of be changing this, kind of overriding the value. There's no really good reason for that. So the best thing to do would be, because you can think of those as just random values that they're IDs, right? IDs do not signify anything. So there's no point in kind of providing a value of, you know, let's say 15. But let's do it. Let's just do this. And let's say, you know, call. And let me save here. Of course, it works fine. Now, what do you think will happen if you create a new row and you give it and keep it as the default? Okay, so Zach is saying 12. Let me see something. Let me just say 6. Robert is saying is 16. That's good. I like that. I like that you're thinking different. You have different ideas. So let's do it. I think I know the answer, but I'm gonna commit. And I think the answer is gonna be what Stephen and what Zach is saying, 12, which will actually cause some issues at some point. But let's try that. You can see it's 12. Okay, that's good. Let me try to do other stuff now. Let me go to T. That's gonna be 13. That's kind of an easy one to guess. Let's do another one. P, and that's going to be 14. That's an easy one to guess. Now, how about this one? What do you think will happen if I do another one? Well, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, clearly, it can't do 15 because that'll be, I mean, this is a primary key. It can't do 15. So what do you think will happen? Not seeing anything. So I think Zach is saying 16. Stephen is saying an error. Okay, so these are all good answers. I think that it's not gonna like it. It's gonna give you an error, and that's where kind of problems start happening. Like, let's try to commit. You can see it didn't like that, because for Postgres, it thinks that it never assigned, I mean, it knows, not only thinks, it knows that it never assigned 15. And that's true. It never assigned 15. 15 was assigned by us. So Postgres is not aware of this 15. It just has an auto increment. Every time you create a row, it'll increment by 1. If you delete rows, it's not going to care. It's just going to keep incrementing ones. And you don't want to really give it a value here. And because you can see that it's an error here. Now, there are ways to actually fix this. Of course, the easiest way would be to kind of replace this with something like 5 for now. But there are ways where you can kind of change the current value of this kind of incrementor. So you want to say, okay, right now, let's kind of start at 20. Let's start at 16. So we can do that. I'm going to refresh here. I'm going to say, yes, I'm going to lose the last one. I'm going to change that to 5, and I'm going to create a new one. And that one's going to be given the value 15, and we kind of fixed it. You see, guys, what happened here? It actually gave it 16, probably because it failed. And when it failed, it did the increment. So that's kind of an interesting. So what happened is probably before it tried to do 15. So the last value got at 15, but it couldn't kind of use it. And now when you try to put another value, it gets to 16. So that's kind of a minor, that's interesting, actually. Let me try to do something. Of course, now if I do a new one, it'll be 17. So let me make this 17. And of course, let me save it. That'll be fine. But when I add a new one, it's not going to like it because it'll say, no, my last value is 16. So the next one's going to be 17. I know that it's not going to like it. So let me try to save. Okay, it didn't like it. But now, what if I try to save again? Would it increment again to 18 and work? Let's try. Oh, you see, guys, what happened? It actually, so even though it didn't work, it actually did the increment. So that's interesting. I actually didn't know that this would happen. Okay, guys, do you have any questions about anything here? So let's go back to that, show you kind of some of the stuff that we did. So this is really what we did. Essentially, this was here. We can like add a new column. Where is it? Actually, it's not here, it's here. Okay, so we kind of another option would be to do this, kind of add a new column that doesn't have a primary key constraint, but then add the primary key constraint. I mean, that's something that we can do, but I don't think I want to do it now because, time is up for this kind of session. I don't want to kind of keep you here. Maybe you have other things to do. And of course, this one is easy. We've done this before. So this one, when you create a table, create the primary key, we've done that here kind of. So that was, we created a table and we gave it a primary key. So we've done that. But maybe in the next video, which probably will be posted Wednesday night, I'm gonna do this, and then I'll talk about other things that I'll be posting. So do you guys have any questions about anything we did today? So we talked about, quickly summarize, adding a column, removing a column or dropping a column, adding a column with a default, adding a primary key with an auto increment, adding a column with a default, same thing, but this is kind of a string. Removing the default, again, we'd like to kind of add a default, which kind of didn't work for us, but that's okay, I'll look into that. And you've actually seen that before, kind of displaying a table in a particular order. You've seen that before. And of course, we had a good discussion about kind of what happens in primary keys if you try to kind of change those values. And so that was what we did today. Do you guys have any questions before we end it?